Older Americans Month speaker series. This month we have two very special guests who will share their perspective on what it means to be older and or aging in a society and a culture they may not be particularly welcoming. Older Americans Month is also a time for us to celebrate all of our older workers and those looking for jobs, because we as a country and as a society will become so dependent on them that the importance of informing our nation's employers and our decision makers around the value that older workers bring to our workforce is absolutely critically important. Today's guest is Janine Vanderburg, Director and Chief Catalyst of Changing the Narrative and Chair of the Encore Leadership Council. Nearly 2 million older Americans exited the workforce during the COVID pandemic. For most, it was not out of a desire or ability to retire. Many want a path back into the workforce, but ageism continues to stand in their way. And with more than 90% of organizations excluding ageism from their DEI framework, there is no sign of change on the horizon. Joining Janine Vanderburg, who's also, by the way, a board member of CWI Labs, is my friend and colleague, veteran journalist and author Harold Fisher. They will discuss the need to reinvent DEI in our country and to talk about aging and all the obstacles that comes with trying to find an employer or opportunities that will allow people to live in dignity regardless of their age. Over to you, Harold Fisher.
Gary, thank you so much for that introduction and, of course, your leadership in addressing the issues of diversity and inclusion. Today, we will take a deeper dive into a workforce topic that employers and some workers may not consider: bringing older workers back into the fold of employment. Unemployment in the United States right now is at near historic lows. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the March unemployment rate is at 3.6%, but employers are still looking to fill positions. Where are older workers in this economic equation? As Gary just said, joining me to discuss this wide-ranging issue is Janine Vanderburg, Director and Chief Catalyst for Changing the Narrative. She is also chair of the Encore Network Leadership Council. Janine, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Harold, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today.
So let's get right into it, Janine. First, give us an overview of where you believe older workers are in the current employment situation.
So I believe older workers, and specifically older job seekers, are frustrated by this apparent paradox. As you and Gary have pointed out, we have low unemployment. We have, everywhere we go, help wanted signs, employers not being able to meet their growth projections, having to retail businesses, restaurants, not being able to fill shifts. In the nonprofit sector, people who need services going unserved because they can't staff up. So across sectors, we've got these incredible shortages in talent. And at the same time, we have older workers who are and older job seekers who are looking for jobs who aren't being considered. So we've got this huge paradox going on. And my hope is that conversations like this help us kind of reduce the friction there in that paradox and have these groups come together.
Mm-hmm. Before we get deeper into the issues, talk to us about the language. Why the term older workers instead of what we've seen in the past, the term seniors? And why does that matter?
Great question, Harold. Thank you. So an organization called Frameworks Institute, at the request of some of the leading aging organizations, a few years ago did research about how language affects how people think about things. And we know that in this country, that aging is viewed for the most part as a time of decline, deterioration. There are a lot of negative stereotypes about not only aging, but about people who are older. And what the framework's research found was terms that are in common use, and many of us may have used them, like senior, senior citizen, elderly, actually reinforce all of those negative stereotypes. So what we prefer to do is to talk about, the fact older workers, older Americans, or be very specific about age. So, our research, for example, is covering people aged 55 and older, and using specific and descriptive language instead of using language that, one, otherizes people, but casts them as this group apart and reinforces so many of those negative stereotypes, which, as we'll discuss later, simply aren't true.
So I would imagine the term older worker doesn't necessarily mean old. I mean, that could really encompass a much broader population of, for this conversation, the workforce.
Absolutely. So all of us, if you think about it, are older and younger with respect to each other. But yeah, older worker can, and, for the part of employment programs, et cetera, a lot of people will, at age start 50, saying groups of people age 50 plus might be in that older worker category. We know that when unemployment statistics, et cetera, and some of the research that's been done about older workers tends to look at people age 60 and older. And that's why it's really important to be very specific about who you're actually talking about. But yeah, older worker can encompass anybody. And depending on the field that you're in, if you're in tech, older worker, you're an older worker in your late 30s.
Mm-hmm. And if you're in politics, you're an older worker if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s.
I'm not going to comment on that.
But let's talk about you for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about changing the narrative,
You bet.
your role, and also your work with the Encore Network Leadership Council.
So changing the narrative started in 2018, and it was kind of part of the larger national effort about how do we reframe aging and get people to think differently, to talk, think, and act differently about aging and about ageism. And so we started in 2018 in Colorado, and in that first year in Colorado, I traveled to 42 different locations around the state giving workshops on ageism and specifically about ageism in workplace. And at every single workshop that I did that year, urban, suburban, rural, in Colorado, frontier, somebody would raise their hand or come up to me at break and say, that ageism in workplace thing you're talking about, it happened to me, it happened to my partner, it happened to my dad. It was rampant. Now, there was data out there that workplace age discrimination, but hearing all of the stories, and there was one story in particular that really started focusing our efforts on workplace, and that was in a rural county. I was doing a workshop on reframing aging. It was late in the day, so it was followed by refreshments, kind of a buffet. And there were a group of women my age who literally were taking the food and putting them into tote bags. And so I sat down and talked to them and said, what's going on? And I realized that there were women in my age in their late 60s trying to live on $500 and $600 a month of Social Security. Like many women, more likely to enter poverty as they get older because we're more likely to have stepped out of the workforce or more likely to caregive for children, to caregive for older parents, plus having been paid less probably over a lifetime, especially true of women of color. And so and what really struck me, and this was the first indication to me of the paradox, this was before the pandemic. And in that particular town, there were help wanted signs in every store. And I was like, well, there are help wanted signs in every store. And they were like, we've tried, we cannot get hired. So that led us to think we can't just talk about reframing aging and ageism broadly. We need to really hone into the workforce and talk about how this is affecting not only older people, but how it's affecting workforce and how it's affecting our economy if we don't start addressing this. And so what we did at Changing the Narrative was convene people who were in HR, in a health company, in a brewing company, in a startup tech. And we basically storyboarded and said, okay, what are all the stereotypes out there about older workers? We did the research and that actually refuted all of the stereotypes. And we put together what we call the business case for older workers in intergenerational teams. And then we just, we started reaching out to people like chambers and HR groups and saying, hey, we've got a presentation. If we can drop in and do this at breakfast, keep in mind, this is the year before the pandemic. And people were actually pretty open because of the talent shortage. And we ended up in that first year, I think, reaching about 900 business and civic leaders. And most of them said, okay, where can we find these older workers? So I think a big recognition that we had at Changing the Narrative was that employer education could make a difference. Now, of course, then the pandemic happened, so that's another story. The Encore Network is basically a coalition, a global coalition of organizations and leaders who are working with people age 50 and over, really thinking about what is this next phase in their life. So there's a lot of alignment between what Changing the Narrative does. And our goal in the Encore Network, again, very aligned with Changing the Narrative, and the goal of this is to transform what people think about all of us as we age, to get rid of those stereotypes, because we know that's better not only for all of us, we know it's better for everyone, right? The one thing we all have in common in this call is today's the oldest we've ever been. And I want everyone to think about this before you go to sleep tonight. It's the youngest you'll ever be, right? So we're all getting older. So we're doing this not just for ourselves and for generations to come, but more importantly, if we want our economy to grow and thrive, workforces need people across generations, and we need to figure out together how to make that happen and get ageism out of the way.
You said a lot there, and I want to go back to something you said about those initial meetings in 2018.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the difficult stuff. What were you hearing from employers, chambers, organizations who could possibly hire older workers, but were sharing stereotypes? What were they saying?
Oh, yeah. So here are the standard stereotypes, right, about older workers. And let's go through them all. One, they're not willing to learn, and they're digitally incompetent, right? Well, there's tons of research that shows that actually is not factually correct. And it's really important to keep in mind the nature of a stereotype, right? The fact that your Uncle Harry may not want to use a smartphone does not mean that everybody Uncle Harry's age is incapable and unwilling to learn technology. In fact, AARP research, and they've been doing some amazing research on refuting stereotypes, just released a study that showed even during the pandemic, almost 60% of older workers wanted additional training. They were willing to learn, et cetera, but only half of that were actually offered training by their employer. So that's one of the stereotypes: won't learn. The big stereotype: I'm not going to hire someone older, they're going to leave. Tons of research has showed that actually older workers on average have 4 times the tenure of younger workers. And this is not to denigrate in any way younger workers, right? At different stages of our life, we want to do different things. There's the classic, and I actually encountered this in the course of Changing the Narrative, having friends who ran businesses said, Janine, I love this ageism stuff you're doing, but if we as older people stay in the workforce, aren't we taking jobs away from younger people? Every serious economic study that has looked at that is called the lump of labor theory, right? It has disproved that and showed it's not true. And actually, the longer as we get older, we stay in the workforce, the more economic activity that generates. And so that's actually better for all workers. There's the standard, older workers are going to cost too much. And that, we really need to think more seriously about cost benefit analysis, about the type of jobs that we're talking about the loss that you have when that institutional knowledge walks out the door. So there was a really interesting article yesterday in the New York Times, what millennials are thinking about work. And it was a focus group of 12 millennial workers across the country. And what I found fascinating about it was that younger workers were actually saying they were worried about the fact that older workers were walking in the door because they were losing some of that institutional knowledge. And other research has showed that younger people really want mentoring. So those are some of the things that we heard kind of again and again. And when we were able to kind of present the research and the stories that refuted that, that was when, and actually I think we did somewhat of an evaluation that year, and 87% of the people said, okay, I'm willing to consider older workers. We've got this other myth that is going on right now. And so I feel it wasn't something that certainly we talked about before the pandemic, but we've got this myth of the great retirement, right? That all of us have decided, well, we don't want to work, right? And we're just all living off our 401ks and we're going off on cruises and all of that. And I think it's really important to note that, and Gary noted this at the outset, that most older people who left the workforce did not do so willingly. The people who, quote, so-called retired basically left the workforce after a long period after being laid off of trying to get back in the workforce and knowing that because of ageism, it takes older people longer. And so finally kind of stopped looking. And the Schwartz School of Economic Policy Research has issued some really great research on that. So we know, so that's a great myth, but it also contributes to this idea that employers have, well, I'm not going to hire someone older because again, they're just going to leave. And what we know, and I know this from my friends who run workforce development centers around the country, older workers are beating down the doors of workforce development centers and they want to work. They want that additional training. And if employers are smart enough to figure that out, we're all going to do really well.
And I would add to that, anecdotally speaking, when you talk about, for example, older workers versus younger workers, that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that the concern about older workers leaving, I don't really think that, as your statement suggested. I think it's more likely that the younger workers are going to be leaving because a lot of them are trying to climb the ladder.
Right.
They're trying to move forward. They're trying to move up and out, whether it be to another division or to another company, where I would imagine that a lot of the older workers, if they get their foot in the door, they're already established,
right,
as far as home life. They're not going anywhere.
Right.
They want to be employed. And you're not going to see, an older worker, and you may, but you're not going to see an older worker who gets a job in Maryland and then there's another position in California. He or she will probably say, no, I think I'm going to stay here. And that, I think that offers a bit of permanence to employing.
I think you're exactly right. You're exactly right. I mean, that's kind of the way it plays out. When we're, and then, again, this is not to disparage younger workers. When we're younger, we do. It's what we did. It's what we do, right? We go off to college. We go to graduate school. We might get married. We might have, we move in for, upper economic mobility, and those kind of priorities are less important as you get older. So, and that's why the research, so there's a lot of stories about it, but actually the research shows that on average, older workers have 4 times the tenure of younger workers. So especially now when we've got all those help wanted signs, let's start thinking about how we fill the talent pipeline with people who want to work, and keeping in mind that today, there's also an economic imperative to this that we haven't talked about it, right? It's kind of demography. So we know, and I think most of us has seen that US Census chart, right? That shows that in 1960, population pyramid of the United States looks like this. Whole lot of younger people tapering up to a really small number of older people. Well, today, in 2060, it's going to look like this, with even bands of age across the lifespan. So we also know that a baby born today has a 50-50 chance of living to be 100, right? So we're doing this for generations to come. So what sense does it make for us to think about prime working age being the ages of 25 to 54, or normal retirement age being 62 or 65, right? That doesn't kind of correspond anymore with the 100-year life. So we know that people are living longer and, for the most part, healthier lives. We know that this is a trend that's going to continue. We also know that in the United States, as in most developing countries, we have a dramatically declining birth rate. So anyone who is simply seeking to fill their talent pipeline with we're just going to look younger and younger and younger, isn't going to be able to do it. And, I like to think there was that famous case that was all over the media a few months ago with a company that I won't name, calling its older workers dino babies, right? And let's get rid of the dino babies. And I'm like, I actually think that the dinosaurs are going to be the employers who ignore the fact of this increased longevity and what older workers can bring to the table, and who allow ageism to get in the way and refuse to think about older workers as part of their talent pipeline.
We do know, as you described earlier, that there are some older workers who are trying to re-enter the workforce to supplement their income or their retirement. And then, of course, there are those who may be retired but are looking for a second act career, no matter where they are on that spectrum. Let's talk about some of the things that will help older workers get back into the workforce. And first of all, let's talk about what are the impediments for them as they try to do that.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about the impediments first. And I had a fascinating conversation 2 days ago with a friend of mine who runs an older worker program at a workforce center. And I said, okay, I'm getting those calls from employers again about where do I find the older workers? And she said, they should look in their applicant pool because the older workers are there. So, and I say that not to joke about it, but to say that older workers are actually applying for jobs. Here are the things that get in the way. If an employer has applications and algorithms that ask, for example, for high school graduation dates, so we know that it is illegal to ask someone their age, but in most states, it is not illegal to ask someone their high school graduation date, which for most of us is approximate for our age, right? So that's kind of a level. There are a lot of automatic tracking systems, right, that look for certain things. And so if those particular buzzwords, or simply screen out certain levels of experience in the recruitment process itself, when employers, put things in recruitment. Well, I want a digital native. Well, you can't, at a certain age, you're not a digital native. I consider us to have a more valuable characteristic. We're actually digital learners. We've figured this all out. But those are a lot of the things that just automatic at the application, the recruitment and application process interfere. And then we also have bias. And one of the things that I think it's important for all of us to know is we all have implicit bias, right? It's not like there are the good people here and here are the bad people with implicit bias, because of the messages that so many of us have absorbed from the time we're very young, that older is bad. Aging is bad. We are surrounded by messages in advertising, in media, in movies, in birthday cards. Aging is bad. So we've absorbed that. And so now we've got an interviewer who's looking and it's like, oh, old person, right? So we've got this prejudice and stereotype. So one, I think we need to look at our systems. But the way, and I think, tying into reimagining diversity, equity, inclusion, I think what companies and many employers have done really well and under pressure is to think differently about what are the benefits of diversity in the workforce. How can we make things more equitable? How can we create inclusive environments, inclusive cultures? And now what that next step that employers need to do is think about that in terms of age as well. And as Gary, indicated at the outset, most of the studies that have been done on that show that most employers, when they are putting together their policies, don't include age as part of it.
So from your perspective, what do you believe that employers are missing out on? Two different things. What are they missing?
Yeah.
And what are they missing out on when they don't consider older workers?
Yeah. So I like to call it, and this is just a memory thing for me, I like to call it the ABCD. So I think what employers are missing out is the actual strengths that older workers bring to the table. And what we know is that, again, on average, as we get older, stronger soft skills, stronger communication skills, probably because we've made so many mistakes over a lifetime that we've learned from. We also know there's a thing called pattern recognition, right? The ability to put things together and see patterns that emerge, which can be really useful for innovation. There is a sense, I heard a number of employers who have embraced bringing older workers on say this to me during the pandemic, that having older workers brought kind of a sense of calm when everybody was panicked, what's going to happen, et cetera.
Mm.
Workers who had been through the Great Recession could tell others, it's going to be okay. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be okay. We can get through this. So there's that. Then we can look to the research and we know, so this is our B, we have better team outcomes when we have intergenerational teams, right? So the best teams actually have that combination that diversity brings of older people and younger people, as well as other forms of diversity. And those age diverse teams have been found to have better team problem solving, better creativity, et cetera. And for private sector employers, what's important is more productive and more profitable, right? The C, I think the customer and the client is really important to look at. So we talked earlier about the demographics. So as our country and our society is becoming more age diverse, that means also that our customers, or if we're in a nonprofit sector, our clients are also older, more age diverse. And think about what happens when you are developing products and services and you don't have the voice of actually the people who are going to purchase that at the table, right? So what we've heard from people who've embraced this idea of becoming an age-friendly employer, for some of them, it's walking the talk, right? They know that they're deliberately going after a market that has a lot of money, that has been called the longevity economy by AARP and others, and they want to tap into that market. And so it makes sense to have people who can represent that market on the table. But it also, it provides this kind of valuable insight about what are people actually looking for. Too often people think, oh, older products, right? It's all going to be, they say it's going to be, bland and beige. And people don't think about the wide range of things that we are interested in as we get older. So that kind of perspective can add a lot to an employer. But ultimately, to me, this all comes down to demographics. No matter whether you are public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, if you're not looking at the demographics, if you're not looking at older work as part of your talent pipeline, you're not going to be able to fill slots. It's that simple. So you're not going to be able to meet your business goals.
I would also imagine, from the perspective of the employer, not the employer, of the business, that there is, if you are developing products and services, it is profitable to also include not only as workers who have the institutional knowledge to share what this product may mean, not just for the masses, but a targeted older customer. Because as we do know, there are people who are retired who don't want to enter into the workforce because they may have disposable income. And so you can't forget about them as clients, as consumers, but you also have to know what they think. And I think on the other side, and again, anecdotally speaking, one of the things about it in my business, and this is across the board in journalism, is that when you have younger reporters, for example, you need seasoned, older editorial staff. So when they say, well, this is the first time that there's been a woman mayor in city X, and then you do have the older worker who will say, just a minute, that's not the case. There have been 2 women mayors in the city before, and you may or may not be able to Google it. But the reason that you have
Right.
the older worker, that experience, he or she will say, the reason I know that is because I was there.
Right.
And that will provide the kind of context that and again, in a news media story, that if another television station or another newspaper, another media organization does not have that older worker, that they make the mistake, we are accurate and provide context. And I would imagine that would be for anything, whether you're making widgets,
Right.
whether you are in construction, when you have that older worker who can provide that the context of history, that could very well make a better project. But I digress. But
No, I actually think that's such a great example of what the benefit of intergenerational teams are, right? Because you can together you can bring that perspective. In media, you can build a better story. I want to share it. It reminded me for some reason of this other story. So I was at one of these kind of longevity economy kind of summits, right? Where people are showing the new tech gadgets, right? That are going to help us as we become a more age diverse society. And some of them were really interesting and really good. One of them, this person was pitching, look, you can put this basically in your parents' refrigerator and it will tell you what they eat. And I am sitting there and I remember like literally picking up my phone, texting my daughters and saying, if I ever find that couch my refrigerator, you're both disinherited. Now, this was just, it was sort of the idea.
Leave my chocolate covered cherries alone. I'm going to eat them whether you want me to eat them or not.
That would have been a good one. But if there had been older people in the room around the pitch, they would have said, there might be other ways to talk about this in a way that is actually useful to the older parent and isn't going to like set them irate. Oh, great. My kids are putting secret devices in my refrigerator to spy on what I'm eating. And if I want to have chocolate cake, I'm going to have chocolate cake.
Exactly.
That's it. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about workplace culture. So you may have an employed older worker in an office, but the supervisor have his or her age. Now, how can that worker manage that dynamic so that we don't see a clash? How would you advise them?
Well, so the first thing I think that we need to do writ large is get rid of all the generational stereotypes, right? And I say this as someone who maybe 10 years ago actually did workshops on look for this in your this generation. And that's kind of one of the things like that I have ditched from what I do, including using words like senior and senior citizen. As when we know better, we do better, right? Poet Maya Angelou said. So I think the first thing is that we don't make assumptions about generations, and we don't assume that because someone is younger or a millennial that they are going to be like this, and we don't make assumptions about someone who's Gen X, and we don't, and we certainly don't want to make assumptions, about boomers, Gen Z, right? So a lot of conflict is unnecessary. To me, it comes down to, getting to know the person. If people are asking you questions that are somewhat ageist, you might ask, well, why do you think that? Or why are you asking that? But just trying to have kind of conversations instead of making assumptions that older people are always going to act like this, and therefore we can only say these things, or people who are millennials are always going to act like this. I, having two very hardworking millennial daughters, the same ones who I've told don't spy on whether I have chocolate cake in the refrigerator, I get incensed when people use the term entitled millennials. I'm like, that's ridiculous. It's just these rich judgments. And I always like to think, who is benefiting from pitting generations against each other?
Okay.
I don't know. I'm going to leave that question. I'm not going to answer it today. I think it's a longer conversation, but who's benefiting by doing that? And I really, believe that, just having conversations and not making assumptions, not having stereotypes about what someone is going to be like because of their age is the best way to proceed in this space.
So do you believe the onus is on the older worker to fit in? Shouldn't younger workers and indeed the employer provide a more inclusive culture?
Okay, so let's take one of the things I talk a lot about is and this is kind of based on the 4 I's of oppression, right? But adapting it to ageism in the workplace. So one of the things that sometimes get in our way is as older workers is internalized, right? Ageism. So we've absorbed ourselves ageist messages so long that we may internalize it, and that can become a problem. So if someone says, I'd love for you to be in this training program, and you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm not ready to learn new things. That's internalized, and we also know that overwhelmingly that's not true. That older people, as we get older, we do want to learn new things, and that's why all the organizations that do lifelong learning have been so successful. Internalized between two people. So, and that can be in either direction, right? It can be older workers being ageist against younger, so not giving someone an opportunity, as well as younger people being ageist against older people. But I think, to your point, we need to move up to that institutional level and say, what are the policies we can put in place? What are the expectations we can put in place? What are the guidelines we can put in place to let people know that we value an age diverse culture in the same way that we hopefully value other forms of diversity within our place of employment? And that, to me, is up to leadership, and making sure that leadership not only embeds that, is clear about it, embeds it in policy, but also, to use the trite saying, what gets measured gets done. Make sure that it's part of measurement of any kind of DEI effort. And that, to me, is when I reimagine. I know when this title was selected, when I reimagine, I just imagine going into great, whether it's virtual, hybrid, in-person workplaces that have people of all ages, all identities, all zip codes working together and achieving great outcomes. So that, and we can do that by looking at it on an institutional level. And I want to add one thing that we haven't talked about, and
Sure.
that's why I think that the work of the Center for Workforce Inclusion and CWI Labs is so important. We need to look at this as a policy level as well, federal, state, and local. One of the things that struck me about some of the policy solutions as we were dealing with the pandemic that were coming out of policymakers, federal government, was that we had aging policy. And aging policy didn't really talk about older workers. And then we had workforce policy, and it had all these categories that we're talking about. And we didn't really talk about aging and the need for more age diverse. So we put these policy silos and buckets. And to me, what we've got to do is merge those together and recognize collectively we are an age diverse society that is not going to change. And we need to change the kind of policies, practices, and systems that have led to the situation that we're in now with the great paradox. Ageism exists, older workers want jobs, employers need employees, and we're not putting those together.
Well, let's talk a little bit about examples of inclusive infrastructure that a company could consider. The first thing that comes to mind is, I remember probably 10 or 15 years ago, maybe a little longer, that there was this huge push to make corporations, obviously we're talking about corporations that are financially well-heeled, but they would create an infrastructure that was inclusive for working mothers. So you may have a corporation in a 30-story building, but on the first floor, they have developed daycare. It's almost like the Americans with Disabilities Act, where years ago there weren't ramps for workers who may have had a disability. Well, now there are,
Right.
which means that it makes working a more inclusive environment. So for older workers, what kind of policies or thought processes do you believe should be in place beyond just the boss saying, we need to hire older workers, but you still have to create an environment that works for them?
Right. So I love the example that you used to kind of lead into this part of the conversation, because I think they're very similar, right? And this to me is another example of people like pit generations. And yet certain kind of things are good for people of all ages, right? So flexible schedules, and we've certainly seen this during the pandemic. So flexible schedules, being able to work remotely sometime, accommodations. I mean, there are countries like Germany and Japan that reached a tipping point of age diversity a little bit sooner than we had. And, in Germany, for example, great Harvard Business Review case study on what BMW did is they were worried about their older workers leaving and who's going to make these great cars. And so they simply asked older workers, and I think that's great advice, like what would it take for you to stay? And it was interesting, and some of the things were really simple. They did whole renovations of factories for under $40,000 US, but things like, instead of standing all day to assemble, being able to sit on high stools, having some kind of flexibility and schedule in that. So we know that things like flexibility and schedule, for example, are great for older workers, and they're also great for parents of young children. They're great for younger workers who may be trying to accommodate going to school as well. Thinking about things like, we know that both older people and younger people are interested in mentoring and reciprocal mentoring. So creating the opportunity, you've got an age diverse workforce, don't just let them sit side by side on a Zoom screen or a cubicle. Let's go ahead and deliberately put together reciprocal mentoring programs so that we're leveraging that benefit. So that, I'm going to say in your case, the younger reporter is learning something about the history of the community that they are covering, and that kind of thing. Another thing that we know, and this has been kind of piloted in some places, is being able to kind of scale back. So if I'm an older worker and I've been working 40, 50, and 60 hours a week, I'd love to work part-time. So that's going to cost the company less. But it also, then you're retaining the institutional knowledge. So there are a number of things. An organization that we at Changing the Narrative have partnered with is called the Age Friendly Institute, and they offer an assessment and certification of age-friendly employers. And their assessment just kind of goes through, here are the kind of things that you can do to become more age-friendly. So I think that there's a lot. That's one of the things that I actually feel hopeful about, because there's a thing called social proof, right? And what I love about this particular program is if companies go through it, then they're kind of shouted out. The AARP Pledge program doesn't do the certification process, but it also is an opportunity for employers to say, we want older workers, we're willing to be age friendly. And that creates the social proof, I hope, for other employers to say, this is something we should look at if we want to maintain some sort of competitive advantage.
But you mentioned something else. You were talking about Zoom screens, and we are in the post-pandemic, still in the pandemic,
Are we post-pandemic? I keep hoping, I keep using that term.
Yeah.
We are.
But does that create an opportunity for older workers who, they may want to work from home, and maybe they will be on Zoom screens? Okay. And so are there opportunities that you've discovered as we move through this part of the pandemic that weren't there before for older workers?
So yes, and I want to acknowledge that we really have kind of a tale of two cities going on, right? In this. So for some older workers, the ability to have access to technology, being able to work remotely actually turned out to be a boon, because being subjected to less ageism in the workplace, in the same way for some people of color being subjected to less aggression in the workplace. So being able to do things virtually is a boon. We can't forget that a huge percentage of the older people who are pushed out were people who don't have work from home jobs, right? The people who are essential workers. And so what we really need to think about there, and people whose jobs may not be coming back, and what we know about those workers, predominantly women, predominantly lower income, predominantly lower education, predominantly people of color. So we've got this whole group. So we've got the group that learned how to work from home, and that's been a boon. And for the most part, those people have been able to continue working or get back in the workforce. And we've got everybody else. And that to me is where we've really got to be creative, because we know that we have jobs available. We have those help wanted signs. And we've got to think about, as we've got federal stimulus dollars, for example, coming in, how do we make sure that some of those dollars are used to reskill and upskill older workers who aren't just working for meaning and purpose? And that's, I don't want to downplay that, because that's really important and that helps us live longer and better, but who need to work, right? So that they're not like those women that I met at the workshop who are, scrounging for the workshop freshmen and throwing them in their tote bags. Mm-hmm. So all of us, whether we are, individuals in the nonprofit sector, in government, private sector employers, need to be advocating for the policies that ensure that workers of all identities, of all zip codes, can have access to the reskilling and upskilling they need to be able to continue working. When we, during the pandemic, changing the narrative we kind of wanted to see where people were, because it was really hard to get data, right? So we did a comprehensive survey of Coloradans age 50 and over. And what was interesting to me, very similar to the AARP study that was just released, we found that over half of people wanted some reskilling or upskilling. And these were Coloradans age 50 and over. But when you looked at Black populations and Latino populations, that percentage went up to like almost 3/4, 75%. So people want to, and we've got to figure out, all of us who are in any way involved in this space, of how do we reduce the friction between, we've got workforce development centers who are charged, and other nonprofits that are charged with providing training. We have employers who need workers. We have older workers ourselves. How do we push this all together? I think that's our challenge.
Okay. Janine, we've got a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer those. So we have Sarah from California, and she's asking, with so many different objectives already in our DEI efforts, she wants to know how she can convince her peers and leaders that it's important to expand and include ageism as an issue.
Yeah. Sarah, great question. So what I've found is useful with companies is basically it's the business case. There are not going to be enough younger workers, right? It's demographics is destiny. So it's the business case. There are a lot of people. We'll be sharing kind of a link after this where you can get some resources. And there are a lot of ways to align, right? So one of the things that I think is really important, especially when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, how it's typically been interpreted, and now we're talking ageism, it's not two buckets. There's a huge intersection, right? A lot of the people who will most benefit as we get older from adding ageism to diversity, equity, inclusion, are women, are people of color. And so we need to not create this, we've got this and then we've got this, we've got to merge them. So, a simple example, if one of the things that we know is, part of your DEI policy is measuring metrics at a certain point, it's adding age to that. It shouldn't be a whole new thing, right? So.
Now, Kathy from Maryland is asking, she says, I work with older adults, but she was disappointed to see the administration's proclamation on Older Americans Month include terms like elders and seniors. How do you fight ageism amongst policymakers?
Kathy, it's nonstop. No, and I say this as someone I've been trained by Frameworks Institute in reframing aging. I do reframing aging workshops across the country. I think last year, I don't know how many workshops, but I know I reached 6,000 people in states across the country in these workshops on reframing aging. We just all need to keep at it. One of the links I'll be sharing is we've created guidelines to age inclusive communications. We can point out now, like the Associated Press, the American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association have all adopted more age-inclusive language. I've put those all in our guidelines. And here's what I do, and this is like really, I just send people little notes and say, you may not be aware, or it might have been someone else in your office that did this. No, we all need to do it, right? We all, I truly believe, in the words of Grace Lee Boggs, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. So it's us. We just you'll get the age inclusive guidelines, send them off to your friends at ACL.
I do have another question, David from Illinois, but before I get to David's question, I did want to insert this because one of the things that I know older workers are trying to do, and we talked about this earlier, they're looking for jobs. They're trying to get their foot back in the door.
Right.
Talk to me about resumes, because if you have extensive experience and you are concerned about ageism,
right,
and because some employers may not go to the computer and have you apply online, there are some employers who may want a more hands-on way to evaluate and sift through the pool of workers. But if you're of a certain age, and you've been in the same career, your resume could be 3 or 4 pages long.
So here's what I've learned, and these are for people who are more expert than me in resumes. And we actually have a recording of a workshop that we did for older workers with. So don't do 3-4 pages. Nobody's going to read it. There is a very cool tool that you can use where you paste in the job description, and then you paste in your resume, and you see what word, for all of you who are familiar with word clouds, right? You see what words pop up in the job description. You want to make sure those pop up in your resume. You want to shorten it. You want to really only talk about your accomplishments make it really accomplishment focused, make it focused on all of the skills that you've developed, the outcomes that you've achieved for your employers, whether they're public, private, nonprofit. And there are some great workshops that are on that are put out by workforce development centers, basically in states around the country, or you can go to the American Jobs Center to find them all. And well worth it to take a resume workshop. A particular woman I know had been applying after being laid off from the pandemic. And one of those women who I'm sure, like many on this call, had all the skills, right? All the things. She had done big things, 14 months unemployment, and she just couldn't afford to stop working. So she was not one who declared herself retired, and ended up taking a workshop and then found a job 3 weeks later as a result of the kind of resume tips. So focusing on, it's a great question. It's important to focus on. And we'll have some resources for you on that.
So as I said, I'm going to get to David's question. Dave from Illinois, he's an older worker and he wants to bring awareness of ageism to his employer. How can he do it without sounding accusatory or, having that employer say, David, maybe you don't belong here. Like that.
So that's really tricky when you're an individual. And I think you need to kind of figure, part of it is like, who are you and where are you? And if you're the director of HR in the company, I think you could say, hey, I was just on this program that the Center for Workforce Inclusion and CWI Labs. And there was this, sort of interesting video, if you find out that you think it's interesting after all. And maybe we should look at this and, have a conversation. I think if you are an individual employee who feels like you are experiencing ageism, that's probably a dangerous strategy to take. And if you are someone who's seeing it directed against other people, I think, you maybe have an opportunity to be an ally, but that is probably a much longer offline conversation.
And you mentioned this before, and Tim from Nevada needs you to kind of go back over what you mentioned about the 4 eyes of oppression.
Yeah.
Would you mind?
Yeah. So the 4 eyes of oppression is, it's basically a framework to talk about oppression. But when we've thought about it, changing the narrative applied to ageism, we think, okay, the first is internalized. Often, and this is especially true, so there's an amount of research that shows that actually the older we are, the more ageist we become against ourselves. We've absorbed messages for longer, right? So they've infiltrated us longer. So it's like when we say things, oh, you know what, I'm not going to try for that promotion because I might not get it, I'm too old, or I'm not going to try to learn this new thing. I had one of our volunteers at Changing the Narrative who was like, oh, I don't want to put stuff in Google Drive. And I'm like, we are changing the narrative about older people. Y'all need to learn Google Drive, right? That's it. So then there's the second is interpersonal, right? It's between two people. So when we are engaging in ageist behavior, discriminatory behavior, or simply showing prejudice against, or saying, oh, those older people in my office, they're not willing to use the new database software, that kind of thing, that interpersonal. Mm-hmm. And interpersonal can also just be snarky remarks, right? Of just like, oh, are you still here? Haven't you retired yet? And that kind of thing. So we see a lot of that at Changing the Narrative. But institutional, I think, is really where we need. And institutional, you can think of small p policy, the policies within your company. How do we create those policies in that culture? But I also like to think of big P policy about legislation. One of the things we're working on in Colorado is New York's already done this, but we want to remove high school graduation dates from job applications. We advocated really strongly that workforce development dollars, federal stimulus dollars that were coming in, that a percentage of them be used to reskill and upskill older workers, because otherwise what tends to happen when states think of, oh, we're going to upskill our population, who are they thinking of? We're going to have internships, apprenticeship. People are very focused on younger workers, and so we need to say it's important. And then the final is ideological. And ideological, it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but it's the cultural messages that we get reinforced all the time. And so I think the best way for all of us to address that is by, whenever we see it, speak up and speak out about it. So.
Janine, do you have some brief resources and some final thoughts about the future of older workers in America?
Right. So here's what I really believe the hopeful news is. And I have been accused of being way too much of an optimist. I believe that the hopeful news is the number of people who are now talking about this. So, recently Harvard Business Review did a series of articles on why we need intergenerational workplaces. Mercer's written, McKinsey. So, all of these sort of big business players are all of a sudden talking about increased longevity and what that's going to mean for workforce. So I think that's the fact that those institutions are talking about it. Our challenge is also, so how do we take that to the ground, right, and into real workforces? And that's why doing things like employer education like this, older adult education, is so important. So resources that I will share with you, and they'll be, I believe, on the website after. You can go to our website, changingthenarrativeco.org. We have what we call the Age-Friendly Workplace Initiative. It describes not only the body of work we do, but we have a number of resources on that. So some of the resources, and the other resource that we'll share with everybody is our guidelines for age-inclusive communication, because we know that language matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janine Vanderburg, Director and Chief Catalyst for Changing the Narrative and Chair of the Encore Network Leadership Council. Thank you so much for your expertise and your passion supporting older workers.
Thank you, Harold.
You're quite welcome. And now let's go back to Gary for some thoughts. Gary?
Thank you very much, Harold. Janine and Harold, that was a superb interview and conversation. And I know today's audience will benefit so much from the exchange we just heard. And what I heard was that changing the narrative is about changing and removing stereotypes. It's removing stereotypes to allow for older Americans to engage in our national obsession. It's not baseball, it's not football. America's national obsession is work. And we want to look after our families, invest in our communities, and become productive citizens. And as we age in this country, and as our economy becomes more age dependent, we have to find ways of fully integrating older Americans into our workforce. So we need a call to action around work. Today, roughly 10.6 million jobs are available. We have almost historic low unemployment. Labor force participation rate is somewhere below 60% for older Americans, for people who are Black and brown. There is no better time for us to change the narrative than now. We need to change not just the narrative, we must also change the outcome. And I'm very pleased that today's conversation has started an effort to elevate this conversation into a broader community so that all of us can ensure that tomorrow is a better day for older Americans in our labor economy. Thank you very much.
Gary, thank you so much for that. We want to let our viewers know that this has been a presentation of the Center for Workforce Inclusion and CWI Labs. Resources and information about this event can be found on the websites, centerforworkforceinclusion.org or cwlabs.org. I'm your host, Harold Fisher. Thank you for watching.